Welcome to Unlearning Ignorance, a podcast where once a month we discuss a commonly divisive issue and attempt to fairly represent multiple perspectives. We are not experts, nor are we neutral. Our goal is to show an accurate understanding of conflicting sides in hopes that it will foster civil conversations with an attitude of always learning. But we also want the show to represent you. So every month we will have a response episode where we highlight your comments, emails, tweets, and voicemails, telling us what we got terribly right, incredibly wrong, or something in between. Thanks for listening to this month's episode, where we bring together Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Today, we're going to be talking about pacifism and peaceful, being loving people, right? Just being kind. That's all pacifism is. Just.
Do you see this nice bandage on my hand?
Oh, snap. So yeah, what's up with that?
The funny thing about violence is that even for people who intentionally avoid it, and specifically have a conviction not to commit violence against other human beings or even against any living creature, violence still happens. And I accidentally committed violence against myself earlier today while opening a can of peas.
Peas?
Sweet
Those
peas.
Violent peas. Not so sweet peas.
Not so sweet peas. Mean peas.
Yeah.
And
nope.
Yeah, I was at the very end of the can opening process, and the can opener kind of got stuck. So I just ripped off the last part. When I ripped it off, the jagged part went right in between my thumb and pointer finger. Right there in the crevice of the opposable fingers. And finally was still able to cook my meal, and I was sitting across from my girlfriend, and there's this wonderful irony that while I was sitting there doing some last minute prep and research for this episode on pacifism, she was at the other side of the table watching a documentary series called Fight World. I was looking into different styles of fighting from across the world. So she was researching fighting and I was researching pacifism.
I love it.
And we had a peaceable conversation about
it. Oh, I'm sure you did.
Right. So pacifism being the topic of choice today, how is that defined? It's important before we even discuss any topic that we actually agree that we're using words the same ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because a lot of another just blatant observation I've made of our conversation nowadays is we're using terms in different ways, and it sounds like we're talking about the same thing, but each party's talking over each other, and it's just they're not talking about the same thing by their own just definitions of words. So what we need to establish is to clear up any confusion about what we're talking about, what topic we're addressing.
Right.
And so we got to figure out our best argument, our best definitions we're going to talk about, but want to first address what we're not going to talk about and why we're not going to talk about it, because we either don't find it productive or don't feel we're qualified to dive that deep in a kind of a short format podcast.
You want to just read the basic dictionary definition that comes up?
If you search pacifist in Google, it's going to tell you violence is never justified in any circumstance. So that's what we're not going to address, I guess, because I can't even start that conversation. Or what would you say? Why are we not addressing that?
I can start that conversation.
Okay. We do a little bit of it, yeah.
Just as a fun story, I had a newspaper story written about me in high school for the high school newspaper.
Oh, famous.
Yeah.
Flexing on us.
Yeah. I think the news story was called High School Gandhi. But it was really just from a quick event where a fight was about to happen, and two people were kind of going at each other and getting all worked up and getting angry at one another, and a crowd was forming around them. And the crowd, they were just there to watch. I just walk straight through the crowd in between the two guys. I introduce myself to one of the guys who's getting all worked up and say, like, how are you doing? Hey, my name's Chase. And I turn to the other guy and say, hey, my name's Chase. Who are you? And I shake both their hands just one at a time. And that dissipates the entire fight. And so it's one of those examples where it's like, theoretically, you would think that strict pacifism cannot solve a problem that most people would look on and say can only be solved by violence. But in some situations, you actually don't know that. You never know the future. You never know exactly like what will happen, what could work, how things might turn out. And there are some situations where I think this sort of strict pacifist would look into it and say, like, what you think necessitates violence, I want to take every other option possible first.
But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, okay, you can take every other option first, but now you're not willing to take the next step of violence. Like,
Right.
That's not the way we're talking about. We're saying the line is never violence. So they take every option and it doesn't work. Now they're out of options and they just throw up their hands and walk away, kind of thing, or keep trying the options that aren't working. Yeah. So that's the strict definition of pacifism that I cannot abide. I cannot begin to fathom how somebody can justify that.
Isn't this whole podcast about seeing the positions of other people, though?
Correct. But I do not think there is a person living that holds that view. I think that is an abstract view that people wish to attain, but I've never heard anybody say
Sure.
that.
There is a debatable inherent contradiction in that definition. That the person who is looking at a violent act that could only be stopped by violence and not doing anything to stop the violence, that you actually become the proponent of the violence. So to support your point, that a sort of strict pacifism that would say anti-violence under all costs, never resort to anything violent, would go to the point where you actually are supporting violence of others by refusing to use violence to stop violence.
Yes, and those are the people I want to talk to.
Yeah, and that so it there's a very real sense in which pacifism, in all of its forms, is it is a form of idealism that I don't think there is a pacifist out there who would say that like it is possible for all violence everywhere to end. Even like the silly story I told up front, like violence happens on accident, right? You know, like that's why we have the category of manslaughter in law, because it's we kill each other just circumstantially by turning corners too quickly. I will say, so you read kind of like the blanket, kind of just like basic dictionary definition of pacifism. Kind of moving up from that, there's, as a starting point for researching the topic, of course, we did go deeper than Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is a good place to start.
Yes.
Wikipedia offers, I think, a helpful list of broader ideas. So it says, pacifism covers a spectrum of views, including the belief that international disputes can and should be peacefully resolved, calls for the abolition of the institutions of the military and war, oppositions to any organization of society through governmental force, rejection of the use of physical violence to obtain political, economic, or social goals, the obliteration of force, and opposition to violence under any circumstance, even defense of self and others. So that shows a range, right, of what you described. Opposition to violence of any kind, even self-defense. To the more like big picture of opposing world wars, opposing governmental wars, opposing the military. So, as far as this discussion, which specific definition of pacifism do you want to use and why?
So yeah, I definitely want to go towards two of them. I have a two-pronged just kind of overview. I want to start with the personal, the where how you interact with the world and what kind of pacifism do others feel that they can justify, and where the cap is for a pacifist to stop other violence. What are you willing to do? What are you willing to prepare for? Not because willing to do in the moment is very different than what you prepare for. So we're only talking about preparing and not in the moment, like visceral reaction, like that. Those are essentially unpredictable for everybody. But what level of violence in your mind can you see yourself committing to stop other people from committing violence? And then on the flip side, not necessarily the flip side, but in a more broader sense, we want to lightly touch on the governmental side of pacifism and whether or not, I don't know, America should be the police of the world. Should we have troops in every country? Should America, who has the biggest stick, how should we use that stick? Should we bring all our troops back and only defend our borders? What level of threat should we justify in attacking? What can we see our government doing with the power that it has? And the question is, should they or shouldn't they use that power and win? That's the crux of the issue of pacifism: is when is violence acceptable and when is it not? What is the trigger for violence from a governmental level?
So let's go ahead and dive into the personal side.
Yeah.
So in day-to-day conflicts, the kind of light definition of pacifism on the personal side would be that you lean toward nonviolence. You choose nonviolence whenever possible.
Mm.
And so this would be probably the type of person who wouldn't carry a gun on them, who may not even have one in their home.
May not have even ever used one.
Possibly. Yeah. And this is also the type of person, kind of like that story from me breaking up the fight in high school, who's looking for the peaceable, nonviolent ways to deal with conflict. The person who isn't going to start a bar fight.
But try to diffuse it with words and trying to speak to them as a human and just trying to see the issue of, like, why are they getting angry? Where are they coming from, kind of thing. I love that about pacifists.
And I do think in some cases, while you rejected a strict definition of pacifism, yeah, I do think that there are some cases where, like, someone who truly is convicted by the pacifist ideal would in some situations take it, like when acted upon violently, that they would allow it to happen. It is almost a form of protest to let violence occur to you and not fight back. Because you're basically saying to your attacker, like, I'm not going to stoop to your level. And I do think I think there's something powerful to that.
Yeah, I can see the merit of how that would affect somebody who is, I don't. It would maybe break through somebody's rage or through the anger. I would assume anger or whatever malice they had towards that person who was allowing themselves to be attacked. I could see that as being a very powerful tool to make a stark contrast of how they live their life versus this person who's committing this act of violence.
Right. So I would say the pros to personal pacifism is that it is peace seeking and creative. That it's not willing to resort to what one could say the more animal instincts of human beings, um, to fight it out and let the stronger creature win, but rather go toward our more human side, the things that we don't share with the rest of animals, of our reason, our intellect, and like emotional sophistication, to deal with conflicts and arguments.
Mhm.
So, what would you say would be the cons to personal pacifism?
It comes down to the line. It's I would in the even in the non-pacifist side, we're trying to steelman them too. I would say that violence isn't the first go to. It's not that violence is the best option. It's not that it's your favorite option or the one that is possibly going to work the most. But the the idea of be preparing yourself for the worst. And so I would say the con is that they a pacifist is not prepared to handle the worst of the worst. If they don't have the view of pacifism in that they will match the level of violence to stop the most amount of violence. And it, they're not ready to. So let's just get to the crux. It's generally pacifists are not willing to carry a weapon, to carry a personal defense weapon, or to use that personal defense weapon in the defense of others. And so if somebody's coming at you with a gun and you've tried to talk them down and it's not working and they're about to harm people or they are harming people around you, pacifists have no response. They're out of nice words. People are going to die because they're not prepared to take that person's life who's going to be murdering children, women, people whose lives matter. And so I there is so much violence that you can't prepare for it all, but you can prepare to a reasonable amount to stop the most of the violence, on a personal level. At least in America. Speaking in an American context, this conversation is very different overseas, where you're not allowed as many uh, freedoms
Right.
in regards to personal protection.
Sure. So, and on that point, I think one of the simplest and yet most profound arguments I've ever heard against the pacifist decision is that um, pacifists can only claim their pacifism standing behind someone who's not a pacifist. That it is like blood bought ground upon which Americans have the individual freedom to hold to a conviction such as pacifism. It's only because of the American Revolution and the Civil War and whatever else, and now with these world wars behind us, that we still are a free country. Not every country, not every individual on the planet has this sort of freedom to not only believe in pacifism, but actually be able to act it out, live it out, to opt out of military involvement. That is a very Americocentric liberty opportunity. So that is fair. But I think something that you didn't address on the side of like not being a pacifist is that the also in the category of people who aren't pacifists aren't just the people who are better prepared to defend in times of need, in times of danger, but also like in the group that of non-pacifists would be the people would be like bullies, people who enjoy violence,
Mm.
people who don't mind hitting others around or seek out fights just for fun.
What springs to mind is the another controversial case is the shooting in Florida, Zimmerman shooting. There was only the level of violence enough to kill somebody because he brought a gun to it. There was only one. He may have brought a gun for self-defense, but neither one of them probably would have died had he not brought a gun, had he not brought the lethal force to kill somebody. And I think that's a really good point. That's why police officers in America, if they get into an up close fist fight, it is immensely more dangerous, even if the other person is unarmed, because one person is armed. One person is armed with simple deadly force, and if one or the other gets a hold of it, the other one is probably going to die.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, you're quite right that people bring that level by just introducing that level of violence. It immediately elevates the dangerousness of that situation. Whereas if neither one of them brought a gun to a knife fight, like it may be worked out peaceably, passively, and the bully argument is a hard one because it's the same as, like, I'm not wanting to strawman the anti-pacifist as I'm not wanting to strawman the pacifist who sits in the corner and just watches a woman get beaten in the street or something. I think those are the two cartoonish extremes. Whereas the bully is very real, and I guess the coward is real too. I don't see them as relevant to what we're trying to discuss now.
I still think there's a certain extent to which, like, the view of pacifism, of personal pacifism that you are working with, could be given a bit more benefit of the doubt. That, like, it's not that they see violence and they clam up. It's not that they see violence and they do nothing. Like, for like the example that you just used, to see a woman like getting beat on the, in the street, like in an alley or something. Let's use a decent 1920s analogy. Like, one pacifist response would be to go stand in her place.
Right. And get in between them.
Yeah, get in between them and take the beating.
I totally agree. Yes. And those are the ones I want to talk about, is if after he beats you senseless and incapacitates you, is he going to stop beating the woman now?
I mean, if that's how it plays out, no.
Right.
In most situations, the attacker would not look upon this as some great noble act and think, "Oh my gosh, I should change my life." That is possible. Another possibility is that during that time, the woman was given a chance to escape, or during that time, authorities were able to arrive.
Authorities with their guns, right?
Right. Wouldn't that be interesting? Police officers with no guns.
I do think pacifists have a great deal of, one, courage to be able to stand up to that level of violence with the by risking their own life. Like, that is very noble and courageous to be almost willing to do everything possible of nonviolence to stop a violent situation, and even to the point, I agree, of sacrificing yourself, of sacrificing your own bodily, risking bodily harm to, or even death, to stop a violent situation. I know of a person who has, his form of pacifism is to be as strong as possible to force somebody out of by physically restraining them, stopping the violence by physically stopping them. And that is something we should all try to do, I guess, because a lot of these situations could be stopped by just tackling the guy and restraining him. And I say guy because like 90% of violence is committed by men or something like that. Some ridiculous number. But yeah, pacifists have a very, very noble cause, and I hope they win in stopping all violence. At least personally.
So as we take the transition from the personal side to the governmental side, I want to read a quote from Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. Thoreau being a well-known pacifist. And here he says, "It is truly enough said that a corporation has no conscience, but a corporation of conscientious men is a corporation with a conscience. Law never made men a whit more just, and, by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice. A common and natural result of an undue respect for law is, that you may see a file of soldiers, colonel, captain, corporal, privates, powder monkeys, and all, marching in an admirable order over hill and dale to the wars, against their wills, against their common sense and consciences, which makes it very steep marching indeed, and produces a palpitation of the heart. They have no doubt that it is a damnable business in which they are concerned. They are all peaceably inclined. Now, what are they? Men at all? Or small movable forts and magazines, at the service of some unscrupulous man in power?" So, as we touched on earlier, pacifism is inherently individualistic. That means that in some countries, you will be forced to go to war regardless of your thoughts about it. And so the ability for a government to send people to war against their consciences, in the eyes of Thoreau, makes it an unjust thing. And it becomes this like doubly unjust thing for the person who already sees the war as being unjust. And then you have this second layer of their involvement being personally unjust.
So yes, when it comes to government intervention and conscription specifically is very is a very dubious way of saying, because they're essentially saying this is for the greater good. The greater good being the governmental entity is saying we believe this war is so consequential, it's so important that we have to now conscript you, take you whether you want to or not, and send you out to war because it's so important. It's a very tricky situation because the greater good, I believe we can all agree, does exist. There is a greater good, but what the sacrifice for that greater good is, like where we're willing to where we kind of divide the line of pacifist and not. Like, we're willing to sacrifice our money for the greater good of taxes that build things that the road, and we're not like that seems like a reasonable sacrifice to most people. Whereas going into sacrificing other people, if nobody goes to war, then your country gets invaded. Then you lose the war and you become a new country. And whether or not this new government is kind to you or not historically has been a flip of a coin. And in a more modern age, or at least in our comfy seats over here in America, like that has not been a possibility for decades. World War II, I believe. We can sufficiently say that. And so pacifism in that, at a governmental level, would be only deploying troops when you have directly been threatened, when a clear and present danger exists. Pacifism at a governmental level, I see as like keeping all your troops within your country. You're not sending out people to do like preemptive measures of like quelling rebellions or putting out fires, essentially, which America tries to do abroad by being the police and only responding when a very obvious force is mounting against you. And it is very difficult for me to see the flaws in that. Like I am very attracted to that idea because I see the lives lost in all the quote unquote military actions of the American government right now, and how us putting out one fire of like overthrowing a dictator in Saddam Hussein has now generated ISIS, and even more people have died, and in almost brutally more ways. But he was, you got to remember, he was also a dictator who brutally killed people, but he brought some of the stability to the region. And so, man, it's just really hard to not see that as, because America has screwed up in so many wars and so many, oh, not wars, excuse me, military actions like Vietnam. That was just a mess. And we have a very bad recent history of military action. But then being so passive as to allow military threats to build up itself when you're just sitting behind your comfy border across the ocean and people who you consider your friends, aka allies, are getting hurt. Like, do you what responsibility do you have to them? So that it comes back to the defending others at a governmental level. Do you think pacifists would consider attacks on an ally nation as a clear and present danger to a nation, to a governmental entity?
I think once again here, defining pacifism becomes a very particular act. One that for some people would say, no, like there needs to be specific violent action taken towards our country specifically in order to qualify fighting back in the self-defense style. But even then, like for a lot of that's moving out of pacifism for a lot of people, and that's moving into just war theory, which I think just war theory is usually something that's considered
very juxtaposed to pacifism, for sure.
Yeah, not compatible with pacifism. And once again, I think most ideas of pacifism, especially on that larger governmental scale, come down to a form of idealism that isn't realistic. If you look at like the Cold War, so many countries being asked to like get rid of their atomic bombs, like get rid of your nuclear weapons, just don't have them anymore. Well, guess what? If every single country were to do it except for one, then that one country remaining would be able to blast all the others that just got rid of their weapons. Yeah. Similarly, if you have a nation becoming a pacifist nation, and like, you know, they're demilitarized, de-weaponized, then that's an open invitation for attack from the opposing countries that still have their militaries and still have their weapons.
Do you think pacifists hold that view? That I would almost put that view that a nation should have no weapons, no violence. Like I would put that more in the cartoonish view, or is that something you believe, or you have met somebody who legitimately holds that view?
I definitely know that view is out there.
Really?
I can't put a face to it at the moment.
That's fascinating to me.
That idealist would not just want that for their country, but for all countries.
Okay.
And it could work if every country decided simultaneously to go the pacifist route.
But even in that idealist scenario, we still have rocks, we still have sticks.
Sure.
It's like it's the old saying that World War IV is going to be fought with sticks and stones,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so
Oh, yeah,
it's
like one of my favorite songs to come out in recent years has a line that's like, if we buried all of our guns, we would just die by the sword.
I like that. So yes, so I would say to that person who had that idealistic view is that you can't. It's impossible to remove all the weapons because you would essentially have to take the hands off of everybody. Like there would have to be no fists, and even then, I don't think that would decrease the violence. I would think society would actually be more violent because then the weakest among us would be even more susceptible to the violence of people who are stronger than them. And so the way it is now, like at least in American context, that a physically weak person can defend themselves against a much stronger physical opponent with a firearm, with something that does not require immense amount of skill and to use against somebody who's physically more dominant. But getting back to the governmental side is that the strongest view of pacifism that I like is that you don't do anything unless you or your allies are being directly threatened. Defining a direct threat is incredibly difficult in this day and age because is ISIS sending videos towards us a direct threat against us? Like, what credibility can we put to that threat? Do they have to act on that? Is Russia sending cyber warfare and invading like the Ukraine with Crimea? Like, is that a clear and present danger against our allies? Is it the fact when they actually act upon it, when they pull the trigger, or is it when they're aiming the gun at you?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine it even working. It's something that seems to only like be pleasant in theory. And I'm not even gonna say it's a bad thing. I think it is desirable. Like I think it is the ideal that we should hold to. But I think there's a certain extent to which we also have to buy into the impossibility of it as the world currently stands and
Mm-hmm.
as the world's nations currently stand.
Though I
Um,
do like your idea of exhausting every possibility of peaceful outcome. I don't believe America has done that enough of exhausting every diplomat. I guess at a governmental level, you call it diplomacy,
mhm.
and exhausting every outlet of diplomacy to solve a conflict before you go in with drones, go in with troops. I think that would be my ideal of pacifism is a extremely diplomatic government that uses violence at a extremely last minute resort.
Which, in some sense, brings us back to the importance of defining things, because there are some people who call themselves pacifists and would say that's exactly what I'm referring to. Other people who would say that they're pacifists and would respond saying like, "What you're describing isn't pacifism at all."
It's just
Um,
war.
right. It's so vital to make sure that when you're having conversations like this, that you're on the same page, especially in an issue like this that is so individually specific and has such a wide range of different viewpoints, different convictions, different ways in which it plays out. Is I was doing some research on the relationships between pacifism and different religions, and there really aren't like many like clear through lines. Um, as much as like Christianity is the foundation for some people's pacifism, Christianity is also a huge foundation for just war theory.
Mm.
There is a lot of atheists who are pacifists, a lot of atheists who aren't. Um, Buddhists might often be correlated with pacifism, but Buddhists
Mm-hmm.
themselves would say like strict pacifism isn't us, but like nonviolence is. Um, and so it just ranges so much on either side, and I haven't ran into a single like religion that is uniformly pacifistic no matter what, no matter who's practicing it. And another just interesting thing to run into is that I've just seen different presuppositions, right? Like in C.S. Lewis's explanation of why he's not a pacifist, he uh, kind of starts out his argument from what he puts forth as an undeniable truth that uh, violence is okay in situations of self-defense where you're already having violence committed against you. He considers that axiomatic. And so from like that presupposition, he doesn't need to prove that point. Uh, Somewhere else where I was reading on uh, a Buddhist position, I found the sentence on this is the website buddhistinquiry.org. Ultimately, nonviolence is a recognition of the simple facts that the quality of our life is the same as the quality of our moment to moment thoughts and feelings, and that enmity, hatred, and violence never improve our state of mind. So, like, in this like Buddhist essay about nonviolence, these are put forth as simple facts that this author feels are so, like I said, axiomatic that no effort is needed to prove them. So, he says the statement, violence will never improve our state of mind. That is put forth as something that is just obviously intrinsically true. When some people could easily say, like, no, like, I can punch you know, go to a punching bag and have a much better state of mind. I can do something that has a violent nature to it and come out of it with an improved state of life, with better thoughts and feelings, better quality of life. And so, like, there's examples there that would say that, like, what these different people believe to be, or like the presuppositions that they're coming from aren't universally agreed upon. Just like for the one that C.S. Lewis believed, um, there's going to be people on the stricter side of pacifism who say, personally, I just don't know if self-defense is always is intrinsically okay. Like, one interesting Christian perspective is, if a Christian has a deep-seated belief that no matter what happens, they are going to heaven when they die. And if they're looking at someone who's, breaking into their house, for example, and just kind of assuming based on that action that this person probably isn't also a Christian. And so it comes to a life and death situation of like, I can fight, I can defend my life rightfully and kill this person, or I can not defend myself. If they kill me, I go to heaven. Um, but if I use this moment to kill them, then they're most likely going to hell. That is a situation where it actually seems logical that self-defense shouldn't be used. Um, like that is an interesting and compelling argument from that perspective. So
Yeah.
ultimately, I do think trying to take these personal positions to a governmental level, to a state level, is where a lot of it falls apart. Because that's just not how it works. Ultimately, even in a democracy, not everyone is actually being represented individually. Not everyone ultimately gets a say. Even like in a democracy, a proper democracy, not a representative democracy, where it's just majority wins. it's still the majority, and it's still the minority that's getting left out. And so I think it makes sense that some people can have different views on kind of the macro scale of pacifism and the micro, and someone who leans toward nonviolence on the micro personal scale, but then is also supportive of war on the macro scale. That seems inconsistent, but I think it also makes sense in many regards, and I think that is probably the most practical thing, to be okay with government-wide war and the necessity of it, the unavoidable nature of it, but then also in one's personal life, avoiding violence.
So I would then pose the question you say that it's not necessarily an inconsistency to have those two opposing views. So going back to where we started this, which was
it's inconsistent. But
okay. Because the conscription, right? So if you are conscripted to fight for your government, and you're okay with governmental violence, and now the government's telling you need to commit that violence so that others may live.
Yeah.
How do you resolve that? Or how would one resolve that?
I mean, I read from Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, so of course there's the idea that the greatest good there would actually be to disobey your authorities. But
to choose the micro over the macro.
Yeah. Or to give the government the benefit of the doubt that they know what they're doing, that maybe they're right when they say that there is peace at the end of this violence, and that we are seeking to save lives by going to war. Which is theoretically often the case. Conspiracy theories aside, America's wars have been fought with the ideal of saving and protecting.
So, Chase, can pacifists and packers be friends?
Yes.
What does a friendship look like between somebody who carries a deadly, deadly weapon versus somebody who is fundamentally opposed to ever using that weapon?
Well, on a big picture level, I think there's always something to be said of respecting the thoughts and feelings of convictions of another human being, even if you don't agree. But for this specific topic, this specific conviction, for a packer, as you say, to be willing to learn from the pacifist and take those creative, nonviolent ways of saying, like, maybe violence isn't always the answer. Maybe the times when my mind goes straight to, let's solve this with violence, the pacifist might have arrived at a conclusion that I wouldn't have considered and could be just as good, could work just as well, could be potentially even better. Allowing the two sides to learn from one another, to support for one another. And in situations where something can't be changed, don't try to change it. So if someone is like off in war, I don't like for the pacifist to be a good friend to the person who's like overseas employed wouldn't be like writing letters trying to convince them to come back, or writing letters shaming them for violence that happens. I think you can show support for a person without showing support for everything they do that you don't agree with.
Yeah, and I like the idea of them pursuing the ideas in different manners, because through the ideas of non-pacifists, we have now developed weapons that are less deadly, that are able to go like stun guns. Those are only developed because we were looking for more ways to hurt people, but it ended up being a good way of incapacitating somebody, and finding just short of deadly force is a good way for a non-pacifist to stop violence. And the pacifist way of searching for more peaceable ways, the communication tools, the understanding of psychology, and creatively diffusing situations. I wholeheartedly agree that both of them build each other up in creating what I believe both of their goals, their shared goal, is to stop violence. They're ideally both of these two parties, the anti-pacifists or the Packers and the pacifists, they want to stop violence. They want innocent people to stop getting hurt.
Right.
And them pursuing their different ways of stopping that is an incredibly noble pursuit on both their parts.
And seeing that shared goal in common.
That is acknowledging that both of each party acknowledging that the other has this shared goal is what I believe should bring them together. What is how you can start this conversation of, hey, we both want to protect people. We both want less innocent people to get hurt. And going from there is how you could build a friendship with somebody you are vehemently disagree with.
Agreed. Thank you for listening to this month's episode, but the conversation isn't over yet. We want to hear from you. What did we get right or wrong, and what's your perspective on the issue? By writing in, your feedback can be featured in the response episode we will publish later this month. Email us at unlearningignorance@gmail.com, tweet us at unignorancepod, or leave a voicemail at 972-885-9574. Again, that's 972-885-9574. And by lending your voice to the conversation, you can help this podcast represent the Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Thanks for tuning in to Unlearning Ignorance, and we'll be back next month with another divisively divisive issue.